Welcome to The Week Ahead, a podcast by SBM Intelligence. I'm your host, Veronica Pana Igube. Every Saturday, we explore stories that are shaping our continent. Today, we begin with India's Prime Minister Modi's upcoming visit to Nigeria, the first in 17 years. With over $27 billion in India's investment in Nigeria, we'll discuss the visit's potential to expand trade and cooperation. Will this historic visit deepen Nigerians' Indian ties? Next, Nigeria's economic woes are mounting. Manufacturers report a 1.24 trillion in unsold inventory, a 357.6% spike from last year, while cable TV provider MultiChoice lost over 243,000 subscribers due to rising costs. How can businesses cope? Finally, Mozambique faces unrest over disputed elections, leading to deadly protests and a closed border with South Africa. Could the violence spill over and affect regional stability? Joining us today for insights is policy analyst Samuel Atiku. Welcome, Samuel.
Thank you for having me on the program. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So let's start with the visit of the Indian Prime Minister to Nigeria. Why has it taken 17 years for an Indian Prime Minister to visit Nigeria? And why is this visit so significant now?
Yeah, I think thinking back and looking back, I think it's something that is strange, given the fact that Nigeria and India do enjoy significant, I'll call it cordial relationship, especially when you look at the economic and our trade relationships. For instance, India happens to be Nigeria's largest trading partner in Africa, just for context. And if you look at the bilateral trade number, we're looking at something in the threshold of about 15 billion. Of course, when you look at it between 2021, 2022, and you look at what has happened in there. So, and historically, India, one way, at some point in time, India was a major source of, how would I call it, a major source of where we source our defense equipment. If you recall, during the Abacha era, most of the military gears that you see, the military cars, you see them, most of them came in from India, meaning that even in terms of defense and security, we do have cordial relationship with India. Agriculture is something that's also something to take a look at. I know a whole lot of tractors from India did make their way to Nigeria, and India seems to be doing fine in that aspect. Education, we all know a lot of Nigerians do go to India for training, and then I know a lot of people go there for medical care and all those kind of things. And by extension, also, I think there's been some relationship. A lot of Nigerians, midwives, doctors have gone to India to take some form of career, more a potential CPD program, more like I mean, building their capacity around certain areas. So those are contextual issues. And then, of course, in Nigeria also you have Indians, people of Indian origins that are Nigerians. I mean, we predict ourselves colonial era, people moving around. So it's shocking that, yeah, on the political front, we've not been able to see those front and back movement the way you have with China. But I think this is a welcome development. So yeah, I can't answer why that has not happened. But in terms of the potential itself, which is centering back to your question, I think there are opportunities. One, we could expand our bilateral trade as a country beyond oil and gas. Nigeria, I mean, we could, especially if we're looking to rapidly industrialize Nigeria, if that's the direction of travel, India is a good source of equipment, and so we could explore that one way or the other. There are sectorial opportunities for us in fintech. If they are very fantastic, Indians are fantastic around fintech, and then Nigeria is also doing well in that area. Maybe there are areas of collaboration we can seek out there. In the world of renewable energy, battery, a lot of things are coming up in Nigeria now. We are discovering, I mean, lithium in some places. Maybe Nigeria could potentially become a source of those kind of batteries to supply India. Of course, I'm not thinking about the lithium. I'm thinking of Nigeria actually raising up our manufacturing output and then pushing that into the Indian market. Another thing we could think about is the ICT sector. Yeah, that cannot be overemphasized. The agricultural sector is there, just like I've said. We could look closely at um, learning from them around how they've been able to improve their tariff systems and learn from them in terms of the policy front itself, in terms of their taxation. They've done a whole lot of work around public finance management systems. We could learn and leverage on some of their lessons, and then we could integrate some of those into our own work stream. And so it's a big opportunity for us. The only fear is that can we as a country learn from this process, or is it just a box ticking exercise? I think that's the question that people tend to ask most of the time.
You kind of beat me to it because I mean, when you were speaking and you mentioned we had like a significant cordial relationship with India, my next question to you was going to be like, how do we leverage the visit that is coming? And you mentioned that by us leveraging on the ICT sector, learning from them, from the agricultural sector as well, improving their tariff system. You also spoke about something that was very key for me that I saw was taxation. Right now, the Nigerian government is trying to make a lot of tax reforms, and they have been facing a lot of criticism and pushback on their tax reform. So it's really interesting to see that, during this visit, will Nigeria leverage on all this? And you also talked about public finance management system, learning from that. So, I mean, it's really good to see that. And I hope that we can leverage on the visit. Like you said, let it not be a ticking of the box. Is it? Let's be able to maximize and learn from their success stories as well. But I would move on to say that, do you think there are any specific challenge? I mean, you mentioned one, meaning that are we just ticking the box? But do you think there's also like criticism surrounding the visits that we should be aware of? And if it's just ticking the box, what advice would you give the Nigerians as well and the Nigerian
Yeah,
government?
I mean, yeah, we hope it's not a boss ticking exercise. Yeah, we always hope that because again, if the reason why you're bringing the Indian president is just maybe to add that to I mean, use that as a legitimate banner to say, oh, my government have legitimacy. The global world is actually aligning with me. I think we can we can say, yeah, then the whole essence of this visit is defeated. I mean, it's tomorrow, so I'm sure a whole lot of thinking must have gone there. But I mean, for context, if you look closely at our area of cooperation, I think it's clear to all. Uh, to when we think about the first thing to think about is that what is the involvement, for instance? I mean, we could say, yeah, in terms of people that are skeptical about India, the truth is that India has not necessarily engaged with Africa consistently for a long time, and that explains why you have those gaps. And so, why the immediate interest? Are there political ramification? Is it the geopolitical issues that we see that is forcing their hands, or they are coming into competition with China that seems to have cemented their place one way or the other? The relationship between, for instance, Africa and China seems to be more cordial than the relationship between Africa and India. So, is it more like a global gimmick that is happening? That people will raise that question. I think the second thing also is to explore the fact that, yeah, there are extractive relationship here. Remember, Nigeria, you remember the Dangote oil refinery is there, and then there are lots of pressures on the government to prioritize feeding the refineries essentially with industrial feedstock. Essentially, you prioritize that. Does that have any significant implication to how much crude we sell to India? Is that why the visit is here? So those are questions that people can think about. I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, right? But those are contextual questions you can think about. The third thing that you most likely think about is that during previous Indian African Forum, of which Nigeria is a part of it, most of the promises are yet to materialize. Remember, this conversation had been there for years, and the question people have asked is that all this big talk, what is the outcome of this? In truth, there are no tangibles that you could find from previous conversations like this. So people are saying, are we just wasting money hosting a world leader, bringing in India to the country? That's something to think about, right? The fourth one is that it seems to be in a hurry, right? We typically these things through. The question is that Nigerians engage enough. How many industrial players are actually on the table having conversation? What is the public participatory mechanism built around this? Are the small, medium scale enterprise on the table when this conversation is going on? Are they going to benefit or are they going to be sacrificed? Those are contextual questions to think about that people will raise, of course, having conversation with people. Of course, there are security concerns. We all know that. Um, we historically have had this growing relationship with India, just like I said, especially during the Abacha era, where we got some of their military gears. If you still look at the military equipments that we have, that you see Tata all over the whole thing. But that relationship seems to have waned, and Nigeria seems to have found other place, maybe in China, focusing now back to the United States. The question is that is India coming to assert its presence, right? Once again, and what will be that? Are we go? What benefit do we see there? So I can continue to list some of these concerns that people have raised, and they are
So,
legitimate concerns. But
yeah,
it's
true.
important for the government to come out clear and
Definitely.
let us know what is going on. Yes.
Definitely. So we look positively that the Nigerian government can bring out results from this interaction as well as have resolutions and be able to hold them accountable for some of the promises they have made. Let's move over to the manufacturing woes and the economic woes we are facing in Nigeria. So what do you think are the major factors contributing? I mean, we have reported unsold inventory by manufacturers, and it goes on to 1.24 trillion naira. What do you think is causing this effect?
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, we could look at it from multiple dimensions. I think the first four key things we need to take into consideration is that the purchasing power of people had been eroded. If you notice, before, if you were earning, say, 400,000 naira, for instance, before, that 400,000 naira some few years ago, maybe 3 years ago, was technically about $1,000 per month, meaning your purchasing power is up there. But now, that 400,000, I mean, if you look at it, it's barely how much now? It's been
Hmm,
eroded. If you notice that, right? You need 1.7
sure.
million just to meet yourself there. That's the
Yeah,
first big challenge that we need to. So people essentially cannot buy what they used to buy. And in a mix of when there are economic crisis like this, when purchasing power of people had been eroded, you keep people what people tend to pay for are essentials. For instance, they pay for housing where they will live, they pay for food that they will eat, and then they pay the normal utility bill just to keep body and soul together, right? They have to cover their transportation to commute to their place of work and then back. Those are priorities. So other things are secondary. And that's why you see inventory building up. We knew this will happen already. And at the core of the consumer purchasing power dispute, right? How you it's been able it collapsed for certain reasons. And of course, you can always pin that back on the Central Bank of Nigeria. That's one of the reasons why we have that. The second thing is that because price of goods and services are going up for consumers, what you're seeing, the bag of rice is going up. It's also going up for businesses. And essentially, it means that if it's going up for businesses, their profit line is also getting thin and thin and thin. And once it's getting thin and thin and thin, the essential thing that businesses will do is to lay off workers just to manage. And when you lay off workers, remember, everybody now begins to lay off workers. Those workers you are laying off cannot buy products again. Meaning that again further compress that consumer price purchasing power that I talked about, the capability of consumer to buy what you're doing. And that's why you see inventory building up aggressively. Of course, there's the foreign exchange constraint issues. I don't want to dive deep into that. And then there are political uncertainty also. You want to increase your inventory because you're not certain what will happen tomorrow. And once you are not certain what will happen tomorrow, You tend to produce enough and keep in the store so that you keep things going. So there are very, if you look at Nigeria closely now, those are many issues that manufacturers are actually grappling with. And the implication is not far-fetched. It's going to put more financial strain on the economy and businesses. People will typically lose their job. People are already losing their job, and then that will impact the economy in the long run, meaning that the economy will tend to begin to slow down. And of course, there are different ways you could mitigate that, but those are the concerns that I see that is actually exacerbating the economic woes that we find ourselves as a country.
Yeah, I mean, you had spoken to the purchasing power being eroded and people just basically ensuring that they survive and, cutting down on their expenses. So, what specific policies or intervention do you think that the Nigerian government has to consider to elevate these struggles for both businesses and the citizens? And on the business side, how do you think they can innovate and adapt to survive in Nigeria's current economic climate?
I mean, we have to go back to the basis. The truth is that consumers are actually government and consumers, the purchasing power, what consumers buy in an economy and government buy in the economy are major determinants of how your country will grow. So when you look at it on one side, the government, if you look at the budget for this year, almost 48 trillion naira. Of course, we can ask questions around what the revenue, what revenue is actually informing these kind of expansionary budget systems. And it means that government is most likely going to borrow massively to actually implement that budget. That's if they can implement that budget. And that raises a lot of questions around what if the private sector want to borrow from the same market? What happens to them? They will struggle to borrow from that market, right, to expand their business. That's one big question to come back to. But I would like to go back to the base. The basis of every economic development means that you must have a very good money, I mean, microeconomic indices upon which you can build your economic growth. The truth is that Nigeria has been running an expansionary monetary policy. Essentially, we've been printing money arbitrarily and creating inflation. We need to stem that down. I mean, we can't say this enough. We've expanded base money. What I mean by base money is that base money is the reserves of banks that they hold at the central bank. It has expanded significantly. And that is the base upon which the economy is built, meaning that we have massive excess liquidity in the system that we need to take out. And those excess liquidity are running after dollars. They are exacerbating challenges that people are facing. And that means we need to rain down on that. That's the first starting point. Essentially, we need to address issues around inflation. To make it simple, we need to bring down inflation to a manageable threshold. That's the first starting point for us. The second thing is that we need to begin to think from a standpoint of costs. The way we think in the country presently is not from the cost perspective. We always look at things from a benefit perspective. I can give you a classical example. When you talk to any government official about electricity, the first thing that comes to their mind is that, oh, we need to raise the price of electricity up so that people will have it because of that. That's the benefit concept. You need to think about the cost implication of what you are doing before you begin to make policy pronouncement. The truth is that the consumer has been scoffed in this country already. High energy costs, astronomically above their wage limit. The price of goods and services had gone up. Agriculture, because of the insecurity that you have in the north, food price had gone astronomically up. Inflation is above 30%. That's ridiculous to actually cut it. So we need to go back to that basis and begin to address those fundamental issues by reining down on inflation. That's one. Two, we need to ensure that businesses have access to finance at a lower cost. So for instance, if you borrow 100 naira before and you are compelled, because inflation is 30%, you are compelled to pay 30 or let's say even 35 naira as interest in a year. Essentially, if you borrow 100 naira, within 2 years, you must have paid 60 naira as on interest minus the cost itself. So no business can survive like that. Just imagine yourself borrowing 100 billion and you are expected to pay 30 billion every year, right? And interest alone, the year one. That's massive. That's a big problem for you as a businessman. But if they can reduce that, if the cost of finance comes down significantly, of course, you need to bring the inflation down so that the cost of fund can come down. If that comes down significantly to say, let's say 10%, then instead of paying 30 billion, you are paying 10%. It means that you have other will, right, to play with the remaining money. And that's why we always say inflation and access to finance needs to go hand in hand to address this issue. And then more importantly, we have a lot of policy instability in the country. You see somebody wake up one morning and come up with new tax policies, and the tax policy says that, oh, distributors should tell us who are the people consuming their goods without looking at the cost implication of what you are saying. What you're saying is that a manufacturing sector, right? Manufacturing entity that is struggling already should actually add more costs to begin to track who is consuming what at where so that you can collect VAT to actually. That doesn't make sense because, again, you're not thinking of the cost implication of what you're doing. So those policy somersaults, policy instability is not helping anybody. We need to ensure that we streamline our policy. And that's why consulting widely is an important component of all these things. Yeah, if you could do these four things, one, we address it, we enhance our consumer purchasing powers. Number two, we actually begin to reduce costs. Three, we improve access to finance. And four, we actually stabilize our policy environment. Certainly, businesses will begin to kick up and then things will address itself.
Interesting, really, really interesting point that you have raised here. Hopefully, the Nigerian government can key into the four things that you have recommended. So let's move to our final story where we talk about the Mozambique post-election unrest. What do you think are the core issues that are driving these disputed elections in Mozambique? And how has the unrest impacted Mozambique's relations with its neighbors, especially South Africa?
Yeah, I think again, we're back to the elections. It's always very painful when people, how will I put it now, when elections does not actually reflect, when umpires that should actually conduct election in a more decent and a transparent manner fail to do so. So, to be candid, what you see there is the opposition party, right? Is it the Podemos, right? Accusing the ruling party of rigging the election. And they did claim that there were a lot of irregularities in vote counting and then the intimidation of opponents. That's Nigeria, classical Nigeria, right?
Yeah, yeah, it
So it's it's simple. And then just looking at Nigeria, of course, you know what the solutions are. You know where the problem lies, right? When you
is.
intimidate people, when there's no transparency around how you tally votes, when there are irregularities in how you address things, of course, that will lead to widespread protests, right? It will
Yeah,
erupt. And that's what happened in Mozambique. And this protest, whether we like it or not, some unscrupulous element will tap into that, and then they will turn it into violent protests. And then there will be significant casualties. And then what happens next is that government will say, yes, it's not about election again, it's about the sanctity of the country, right? So they will go into cracking down on people, begin to lock people up, classical Nigeria again, right? Throw
yeah.
people into jail. They will send the military to go and round people up. Then people will begin to raise questions around human rights concerns,
Mm.
right? And then if we don't take in the case of Mozambique now, this thing is threatening to spill over into other countries like South Africa, for instance. And South Africa don't want problem in its own country. So they temporarily close their border. And that exacerbates even more challenges, especially people that are doing trades. Remember, most of these borders are just lines that people draw. People tend to interact with themselves more. So you typically lock people up. People cannot move front and back again. And that leads to economic disruption. And whether we like it or not, there's tension in the geopolitical zone. And then you have this regional stability risk begin to materialize. That's exactly what has happened. A simple, transparent election could actually bring down an entire region down, and that's what we see happening now in the southern South African region itself. So it's quite unfortunate, and that's why we keep saying that election, we keep looking at, if you look at Nigeria clearly, nobody seems to be talking about reforming the electoral system again. We need to ensure that one man, one vote, and that vote is actually count. I mean, do counts. Biometric, we've always suggested biometric voters voting needs to happen, right? We need to remove every element
Mm.
that people in government or even out of government actually put on ground to actually intimidate people from voting. We know that happens everywhere now in Africa, and it's quite unfortunate. It's a tactics to actually cling on to power. And the question is that why are you clinging on to power if the people you're trying to lead are not even interested in you leading them? Of course, the outcome will be disastrous. So to round off, I would say it's quite unfortunate what is happening in Mozambique. And of course, a reflection of that also in Nigeria. We need to ensure that elections are transparent. That's the starting point. That's the fundamental principle of what which any democracy can be built. Empires are falling. If you look at the Ottoman empires, you go into empires like the Roman empires. If you look closely at the Persian Empire, you go and read prehistory and you look at what has happened trajectorily across different countries that have failed. It all starts with when you have irregularities in how people are elected, the legitimacy of the leadership that come into play. We don't want that to happen in a country like Nigeria. We don't want that to happen in any African country. So I would say that's the problem.
So, I mean, you've mentioned the problem is, the African challenge that we're facing, especially when it comes to elections. What do you think could be the role of the African Union now and other regional bodies? What can they play in mediating this crisis in order for it's already spilling out to prevent further economic challenges to the neighboring
Hmm.
countries?
Well, the truth is that it's a big call because, again, there are five principles that you could follow through with. First thing is to ensure that there are independent electoral reforms. But again, the big question is that at the AU level or at the regional level, the people that are coming in there, do they have the legitimacy to call for some of these things? Those are big questions we need to ask ourselves. But more importantly, we need to ensure that we have an independent electoral system operating in each of those countries. We need to continue to talk to ourselves. There needs to be national dialogue among ourselves. That's the way to grow. It's not that you lock yourself because you're in government, you now shut people up. If people are actually raising concerns about certain things that affect their life, you send the military to round them up. That's not a way to go. It will create acrimony, create resentment, and that resentment can degenerate into even more terrible outcomes. Three, we must not compromise the security sector itself. If you look closely at across the world, for instance, if you take a clue from the UK, anything that threatens the security of the country, they act rapidly and very quickly to stem it before it escalates. We need to ensure that, and if you are doing that, you still need to do it with respect for human rights. You must not trample on human rights. For instance, you look at what happened in Nigeria. NSAS, they killed people and then they throw them under this thing and then they come and lie about it. Those are human rights concerns. And then what do you expect in future when people want to protest? People may even go violent and then that could escalate. We must make sure that we don't compromise human life. I mean, if you're a Christian, of course, we like to do that in Nigeria. I mean, if you read the Bible, it's clear there that a soul of one man is even more valuable than the whole world, the whole gold in the world, and all those things. So, if we put that at the heart of our policy design and how we interact with people, I think that will make the country even better. Of course, there must be a judicial accountability. When people have lost faith in the judicial system, even when people commit fraud, right, during the electoral process, but you know that the judicial system will be upright and will stand for what is right. Of course, people will believe rather than go on the street and start protesting. We need to actually make sure that the judicial system is accountable. We know in Nigeria, there are a lot of question marks about that, just the same thing in Mozambique. Of course, there needs to be stronger economic support, whether we like it or not. The reason why you need to think about that. So, what can, I mean, that's your question. I'm providing solution. The question is simple. What can regional leaders do? Of course, they need to begin the mediation process and they need to actually begin to dialogue with the conflicting parties to make sure that they quell and put peace at the heart of what is happening. They need to set observation missions in there to see what is happening in terms of the abuse of human rights and then begin to document that. That's with the UN to do. When people are found to have committed offense and all those things, then people need to sanction them, and then people need to give incentive for those that needs to get those incentives. And more importantly, I think that um, other African institutions, maybe like South Africa and other ones, needs to one way or the other um, build capacity and strengthen institution even within Mozambique so that something like this do not happen again.
Very, very interesting insights. I mean, the electoral reform is something that we have to work on. And I mean, you gave really, really brilliant recommendations about the independence of the electoral commissions, transparency in our elections. The judiciary has to be accountable and stronger economic support. These are just like a few of the points that you highlighted. That's all for today. And I want to say thank you very much, Samuel, for joining us on today's podcast. It has been an interesting episode. You really gave some brilliant insights which enriched today's episode. And I want to say thank you very much. To all our
Thank you.
listeners, thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you for having me on the program. Yes, thank you once again.
Thank you. To all our listeners, this podcast is by SBM Intelligence. You can access our podcast by searching for SBM Intelligence anywhere you find podcasts. For deeper insights into our work, you can visit our website at sbmintel.com. Remember to connect with us on all our social media platforms. You can find us on X, Facebook, LinkedIn at SBM Intelligence. Thank you for tuning in to the week ahead. Join us next Saturday for more updates shaping the African continent.